Hello and welcome to Capital Insight. I'm State Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, and I'm your host for this program, which is designed to help give you some insight into the doings in our capital area, the folks in our community, how government and people interrelate, and those sorts of things. Our guests today are two folks who work with people with disabilities, folks who I think reflect a lot of solid community values and folks that we can be very proud of who work in our community. I'm referring to Kral, who is the Executive Director of Shangri-La and has been doing that for 5.5 years, and Graziani, who is the head of the Garton Foundation here in the Salem area. They are both folks that, as I said, have worked with people with disabilities but have a lot more to them than just that. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ken.
Thanks. Nice
Jan,
to be here.
I'm glad that you're here. I think it's a chance to delve into interaction between people in our community and how others have helped improve that interaction. But I'd like to learn a little bit more about each of you just so that folks back home will understand a little more about you as human beings. Jan, tell us where you're from.
Well, I was born in Salem. I've lived in Eugene and Portland, but mostly I've lived in Salem.
How long is that? You don't want to tell us. About.
I've lived in Salem for about the last 18 years.
And can you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
I attended the University of Oregon, and I've spent a lot of time working toward understanding things about the rehab field, a variety of different programs in that area.
Now, as I mentioned, for about 5.5 years now, you've been Executive Director of Shangri-La. Now, how did you move into that particular position? Is there any particular story there?
Well, it's a great story. Emil and I worked together at the Garton Foundation for about 12.5 years, didn't we, Emil? And at a particular time, Shangri-La was having some difficulty, and I was approached to come there and see if I could provide some leadership, and took on that challenge, and Emil's been a support to me off and on through that time, and we've, I think, been very successful.
Well, Emil, let's turn to you for a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from.
Okay, I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and I went into the service after high school. After the military, I went into college, got an undergraduate degree from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and a master's from West Virginia University.
Now, what were the degrees in?
A Bachelor of Arts in undergraduate and a master's in social work at West Virginia. And then after graduating from West Virginia, moved out here in 1975, kind of sight unseen, and heard a lot about Oregon, and I thought it would be a nice place to live, and moved out here and didn't have any job prospects, and opened up the phone book and started sending resumes to all the social service organizations in the area, and luckily connected with a lady by the name of Sally Gerhardt, who was the Executive Director and at the time President of the Board of Directors for Garton Foundation, and we interviewed and she hired me back in 1975.
So you've been with Garton now for 18 years.
18 years, right. I was hired as a program director and then I was promoted to Executive Director in 1978. I've been in that position ever since.
Well, in working with the Garton Foundation and working with the community, can you give us an idea of how the community interacts with Garton, and also give us some idea of how Garton operates?
Well, I'm really proud of Salem. You know, it has a large number of people that are different. Because the institutions, you have people that are mentally ill and people that are mentally retarded in the community to a larger extent than in other communities in Oregon or across the country. And I'm proud of the way Salem has kind of accepted those folks and made them part of the community. And Garton has been part of that involvement too. We serve 200 people that are disabled, both with mental retardation or mental illness. And our job is to integrate and help people be productive, contributing members of the local community.
Now, what kind of operations do you have? You say you serve people who are mentally retarded and people who have mental illness. What kind of business doings do you have? What kind of operations do you have?
Well, our primary purpose is to provide employment and employment training and vocational training to people, and we also offer retirement services. But for our primary purpose of employment, we've started business units over the years. Recycling we started in 1975, custodial in 1981, mailroom services in 1984. These were all started to give people options on a variety of different types of jobs that they can do.
So you have a recycling operation. You also have a mailroom operation, or
Very
a mail
large one.
house, and then you also have a custodial services operation.
Right, right. Our mailroom and our recycling operation are the largest outside of the metro, Portland metro areas. We, for instance, just the last Friday, we did over 200,000 pieces of mail through that operation, our mailroom.
Have you ever, you work obviously with a lot of businesses then on contract to provide these services?
A lot of state agencies, because that's the largest employer in Salem, but we have a lot of private accounts too, like Willamette, University, country companies, a lot of other companies that we do business with, First Pacific.
Well, Jan, you've been hearing us talk a little bit about Garton, and that should be familiar to you since you used to be at Garton. But you're with Shangri-La now. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I'd love to. We provide two basic sorts of service, residential services and employment services. Our focus in the past has been primarily on people with mental retardation. In the last year and a half or two, we've expanded so that we're now serving people with traumatic brain injury, physical limitations, hearing impairment, various communication disorders, some limited alcohol and drug supports. So we've really started to expand what kinds of options that we provide. We serve most of those people in some form of an employment setting as well as the residential that I mentioned. We have a restaurant, Express Food Services, at the Labor and Industry Building. At the City Hall, we have a food service program. And also at Chemeketa, we provide catering to various businesses and private parties. We have a wood shop that does custom cutting for different businesses. Our primary business that we work with is Willamette Industries there.
So your wood shop actually does custom cutting for Willamette Industries? Is it on a contract basis?
And some other places as well. We have All Seasons Grounds Care, which is our grounds maintenance business that we do work for the City of Salem.
Now I have to say, whoa, how many people do you have working in all these businesses?
We have about 120 people with disabilities that work throughout Salem in about 60 locations. And we have about 40 staff, I would say, that are supporting those people in their jobs.
120 people, and then you've got about 40 people with disabilities who are working in the industries, and about 40 staff.
Supporting them. And then we have about another 180 staff involved in our residential services.
Now, on the residential services side, are these what are commonly referred to as group homes?
Some of them are. We have about 16 group homes, although there's no more than 5 people living in our homes. We also have what's called supported living, which may have only one person living in an apartment receiving staff support so that they can just be a part of the community without having the identity of a group home.
Tell me a little bit about this supportive living. You started to mention someone can be in an apartment, then someone comes in and assists. How does that work in actuality on a day-to-day basis?
Extremely well. One of the things that we found is that the supports that agencies like ourselves provide sometimes become a real dependency for people. And one of the things that we've learned is that the proximity of staff and other people cause the need. So what we found is many people can live very well without a great deal of support if the support is brought in at the right time for, say, budgeting or cooking or medication management, problem resolution, those kinds of things. And then the person's able to pretty much function in the community.
Does that sense of more independence also help with a sense of self-esteem?
Oh, very much so. And I think that the combination of a decent place to live and a valued job that's important to the community is just fundamental in our belief for people to be successful in the world. So that's really very much the direction that we try to take people.
Well, Emil, we've been talking about jobs, and that seems to be the sector that Garton is most involved in. Does Garton get involved in residential living and that sort of thing?
Other than the coordinating with residential programs, no. We don't provide any residential services at all. It's all strictly employment or retirement.
If you talk about employment and retirement, the retirement edge reminds me of something you talked about recently, and that was that there's a change in the community of people with disabilities, that they age more in our community, that is, that they live longer. Can you talk about that?
Sure, and Jan's very familiar. She was with us when we started this program. When the states first started providing services or purchasing services for people, they were providing employment services and not recognizing the fact, and this was true across the country, not recognizing the fact that people were aging in the community and that there would be a time when no longer would vocational services employment be appropriate. That was kind of brought home to us when people that we were serving were kind of trying to hide out away from work and avoiding work at all costs. And we discovered that these people were reaching an age where they wanted to stop working. So we began offering alternatives to work, and we now serve almost 40 people in that program that are involved in community activities, much like you would see if you went to the Salem Senior Center or the South Salem Senior Program, going to see movies, taking activities in like the zoo and things like that. It's an interesting program. There's now 16 in Oregon that offer retirement programs.
Now, Jan, does Shangri-La have that sort of a program where you're moving in that direction?
One of our goals is to try to make sure that we provide services for anybody who wants us to serve them. So we're certainly seeing this phenomena. However, right now, if we have somebody that has that need, our direction would be to refer them to Emil and hope that his program would be able to respond to them. Unfortunately, there aren't enough services in this area for everyone. So after we have this meeting today, Emil and I are going to go off and talk about whether or not we can collaborate on some of those kinds of area issues.
I should mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm your host, Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem. If at any time you have any questions or concerns, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, State Capitol, Salem, Oregon, 97310. And we certainly welcome your comments, suggestions, criticisms, or whatever. And our guests today are Emil Graziani. I keep wanting to give it an Italian sound because I have some
It is Italian.
Yes,
Oh,
we're
okay.
Italian.
Well, I'm glad I'm
Italian.
right about that. Emil is the head of the Garten Foundation, and Jan Kral is the executive director of Shangri-La. We've been talking about people with disabilities and programs in our community. It's interesting that you mentioned, Jan, that you're going to be meeting with Emil to talk about interaction. How do the organizations work together in the community?
Well, Garten Foundation and Shangri-La, along with many other programs across our state, are part of the Oregon Rehab Association. And a critical function that that organization provides is for us to be able to network and give support to each other. Within Salem, there's several other programs that are members of that. And right now, Emil and Jim Seymour and myself.
Jim Seymour is Catholic Community
That's
Services
right.
Foundation.
Yes, it is. Are talking about ways that we can collaborate in areas like transportation, service coordination, resources that we have in common or that one of us has that the other doesn't, so that we can enrich the quality of life for the people we serve and be more an integral part of the community.
So does that also help you maximize your resources and maximize efficiency?
We hope it will.
Maximize state resources too, in that we do receive state dollars, and the more collaboration we do, the more we can stretch those dollars.
Well, Emil, you've brought up the state resources. Can you talk about the relationship that you have with the state, that your organization does and the others do, and how that works?
Okay. We, the county and the state purchase services from us to provide those vocational employment opportunities for people. And currently they make up about 20% of our operating revenue. The majority of our operating dollars come from our commercial operations. And as you know, the legislature is trying to come to grips with Measure 5 and the reallocation of funds to local school districts. And we, as Jan was saying, we try to cooperate across the state and locally on trying to stretch those dollars that we get from the state as far as we can.
Now, in terms of the relationship with the state, is that basically with the Department of Human Resources?
Right. Department of Human Resources specifically with Mental Health and Developmental Disability Services Division and Vocational Rehab Division, Rehabilitation Division.
In working with the state, have you found that the state is overly bureaucratic or is it fairly flexible about trying? You can be as open as you can be about that. I'm just curious what your reaction is.
Well, I think that in the state's attempt to be responsive to the taxpayers on the dollars that they give us, there's a tendency sometimes to over control, and they have to watch out for the small percentage of programs that might go astray, and in doing so, they usually end up coming up with a lot of rules that slow down all of the programs. Slow down in the sense that we can't be as creative as we like to be with the dollars and providing services that the individual needs. So I think that's in answer to your question, I think that's a natural for a bureaucracy to do, is to be over-controlling. Again, going back to what Jan said a few minutes ago, with a little bit more flexibility, we can perhaps stretch those dollars a little further along.
Do you see any movement this session with the legislature to try to do that, or is this something that more has to be dealt with at the agency level, I'll call it the bureaucratic level, working with the agency officials to get them to change their rules? Do you have a comment on that, Jan?
Oh, I have tons of them, Kevin, as you know. I've seen the legislature try very hard to get people to talk about doing things differently. I think that the constraints of federal regulation and state regulation make that very difficult for bureaucracy to do. So while I see our particular bureaucracies open to the discussion, I don't see it very easy for them to change quickly. And one of the reasons I think that programs like ours can survive and do so well is that we value changing quickly and trying to respond to market opportunity and changing needs. So it's never fast enough to suit us, and it's never enough to suit us. I think that over time, as we've understood different ways of serving people with disabilities, we realize that the very monitoring and protections are in some ways the biggest discrimination that we do, making people live in a group home separate from others to monitor them, for example.
If I can use an absurd example from the past, it might be putting someone in a straitjacket to protect that person from himself.
Yes.
Unfortunately also greatly limits that person's freedom.
That's right.
When there may well be a lot of other ways of helping someone deal with, say, a mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And if you generalize that concept to lifestyles, I think it's very appropriate.
Well, then one of the things it seems that we'll have to deal with as a challenge is trying to implement in this human resources arena the change that we're talking about in other areas, which is moving from process orientation to result orientation.
Absolutely.
Or outcome. Mm-hmm.
Outcome
Absolutely.
orientation. What do we want to do, and then let's get there, let's do it legally and honestly, but let's not limit ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And Emil, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Well, it's in the same theme that we have been talking about. If programs, and there's a lot of creativity, and I think there's 100 not-for-profit organizations that serve people with disabilities across the state, and there's a lot of creativity in those programs. And if we can reach a consensus on what the outcome is supposed to be, and then let people be creative on getting there, again, staying within the law and the legal requirements, I think you'd open up a lot of creative juices and energy.
I'm just reflecting on this because I know when we look at the legislation we deal with itself, it's complicated, but then I realize for every law, then there's 10 rules that are out there to implement the law. How do you cope with that in dealing with the rules right now? Do you have people you just have to assign to deal with this, or I'm just curious?
Good question.
Well, both. We have a lot of policies and procedures. We have a lot of systems that we have to follow, and we have within our agency a quality assurance system that we struggle with because it's very rule-driven, and we're not sure that the rules equal quality. But the compliance with the rules equal dollars, and so there's this constant struggle within our agency about how to balance that. We have people who are involved in staff training that provide support to our staff so that they can follow the rules. We also judiciously break rules.
Well, and you used an interesting word there, judiciously break rules. That's a phrase, actually, but when we think about the origin of government and how we vested certain authority in government officials, we expected them to exercise a certain amount of discretion, if I dare use that word. And as a society, it seems like for the last 20 years or so, we've kept restricting that discretion more and more. And then we wonder why people aren't being creative and why they aren't showing initiative when they're hemmed in by all these rules. Are we breaking away from that now and saying, well, let's get back to the nitty-gritty? What are we here for? What are we trying to do? Select responsible people to do the job and give them some room to do it. Are you seeing some movement? I'll ask Emil first.
Well, Jan would probably be better at this. I'm not seeing that quite yet. Jan's a little closer to it in some sense than I am. I'm hoping that once we come out of this session, that we'll take a look at what the intent is and shed ourselves of some of the rules and look at the intent and go for the intent here, as opposed to all this bureaucracy that we put on the system. But I can't say that I've seen that just yet. I'm kind of hoping that once the legislature does their thing and then and then the instructions are given to the bureaucrats that, some of that freedom will be realized.
Are we still dealing with, the worst example is probably the old military mentality of, well, you have to follow the process, you have to follow the rules. Forget about what the rules were intended to do. I just read yesterday this story about a fellow whose last name was, I think it was Smith, and his first name was the same as another fellow named Smith, and his sergeant in the military always went with initial and last name and couldn't figure out, didn't know what to do on the roster about distinguishing them. And just felt stymied because the rule of procedure was to use the last name and first initial, and he didn't dare think about using some other method of identifying.
Like a middle initial.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's the kind of mentality we're still talking about, process-driven, rules-driven, and we're trying to overcome that.
I think that the people within the system want to overcome that. I've thought about this for a long time, and what it looks like to me is that we have one set of rules, a different set of values, a different kind of contracting, and a different kind of actual operation, and that those things are in real conflict. I think it's a great transition that we're in. On one hand, we see our agency people take great risk to support us in these, like, supported living and different kinds of things that we're talking about. And then we see them beaten up across the front page because one thing went wrong for one of the hundreds of, well, thousands of people that they're serving. So as human beings, it must be very hard for people to take those risks if we can't support them through the law and the contract and those kinds of expectations.
I'm going to pause for a moment and mention to our audience that you're with us on Capital Insight. I'm Representative Kevin Mannix from Salem, your host, and our guests today are Jan Kral, who is the Executive Director of Shangri-La, and Emil Graziani, who is the head of the Garten Foundation, both of them, I'll say, headquartered in Salem. If you ever have any questions or concerns, feel free to write to me at Capital Insight, H395, Salem, Oregon, 97310. And Emil, I just sort of cut you off. You were saying you agreed with Jan.
Well, I would agree. I'd like to support that in that I think individuals in the system are really good. We have those individuals in Marion County as well as the state level. But the system can be so punishing when things go wrong that it forces people to really go extra or cover themselves extra so that they don't go wrong. And when you're talking, what, 4,000 or 5,000 people with just MRDD being served in programs,
can you
mental
explain?
retardation, developmental disability, excuse me, that it's almost impossible not to have something go wrong with that many people. You know, the percentage could be very small, but it overshadows everything else when it does.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's the one thing the media might focus on because it's the hot spot.
It's the only thing it'll focus on at that time. Yeah. I mean, if someone gets misplaced, gets on a bus and supposed to go home and gets lost on that bus system, I mean, there was a lot to pay on that because we are all charged with making sure that these people are safe. But you can't put people in the community and not take some risks. Otherwise, you're going to have to be forced to locking people up. That's the only place there's no risk.
Well, when you mention that, I know you've talked in the past about the history of how we deal with folks who have mental illness or who have any kind of disabilities, actually. Can you give us a little sketch of what it really was like in the past?
Well, it's, you know, it's not too long ago either. It was 25 years ago when we had a maximum occupancy at Fairview. We had almost 3,000 people there, locked up and confined, isolated. And through the entire the early parts of this century, we watched our institutions get bigger and bigger as we convinced parents that the institutions were the best place for their children that were disabled. And then during the civil rights movement of the 60s, we also discovered that even though these were not people that were minority groups, but we couldn't guarantee these people's civil rights in institutions. And that led to the institutionalization movement that came along in the 60s and 70s. And Garten, for instance, started in the late 60s, was part of that, downsizing state institutions. And I'm really, like to go back, I'm really proud to say that at Fairview, I think there was less than 400 people there today. So there's
those are-
2,600 people that where they're institutionalized now are living in communities.
And the ones who are still at, the folks who are still at Fairview are people with multiple disabilities that are probably the toughest cases to handle in the community? Although there's still some argument about whether...
You're right. It depends on who you talk to. There are a lot of people who believe, and I believe, that there's still places for people in the community that, for those individuals that are still living at Fairview. It might take additional supports, some new technology, but I believe that people do better, they grow better, their esteem is better, they contribute to you and I when they're around us and not isolated and confined in an institution.
Well, that brings me around to something that Jan has talked about in the past, and that's the sense of participation and fulfillment, earning that paycheck. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Well, I think that, just as Emil pointed out, if you're living on a cottage with 90 other people, you don't have a sense of self. But if you're working shoulder to shoulder with somebody in a wood shop or in a restaurant, then you start to feel more like everybody else and you start to act like it. And I think that with that feeling better about oneself, what happens is that you stop impacting the community in any negative way. That's critical.
Well, as we move in this direction, and it seems that we are continuing to progress towards more personal fulfillment for the individuals in these programs, and then I think societal fulfillment by giving the individuals a chance to be fulfilled. Are we seeing any lessening of the federal pressure to be rigid? Is that the source of some of the rigidity that we've seen in the regulations? I'm just curious.
I think there's always an increase in financial accountability. When we were so poorly funded, even worse than we are now, I think people were glad that we would do anything. But as more dollars come into the system, there's an increase in a need for financial accountability. Financial accountability and programmatic accountability have to be tied together, and that increases the monitoring. So my perception is we have increased federal monitoring.
But the accountability really ought to be in terms of what is produced, what the goals are, what the outcomes are, rather than in terms of the process.
Financial outcome, yes.
And Abel, I know you were going to comment on
Well, it's just that the federal government is, it's a larger bureaucracy, so it usually has more rules around being accountable for those dollars, and the federal government has not moved in any direction of being outcome-oriented.
So we'll have to do the best we can to try to work our way around the federal bureaucracy.
Right. I want to make another comment, if I may, that you know, when we institutionalize people, it also costs a lot more than community services. People at Fairview today cost about $157,000 per individual per year. And that's, you can imagine what that expense would be if we still had 3,000 people out there. But community services, it includes all services, the residential, the employment, medical services, case management, local case management is around 1/5 of that cost. So it's a sizable savings when we serve people in the community.
So what you're really telling us is not only is it personally effective for the individuals and effective for society, it's also cost effective.
Right. And the individual, it's a win-win situation. The individual is benefiting, the community is benefiting. They're benefiting in ways that the people in Jan's program, the people in my program spend their paychecks in the community. They're earning their way, they're covering some of the cost of their living expense in the community, and they're spending their paychecks buying goods and services in the community. I can't think of a better situation.
Win-win situation.
Yeah.
And with that, I need to say that our win-win situation is wrapping up because our time is up. I'd like to thank you, Jan, for joining us, and Emil for joining us.
Kevin?
And I'd like to thank the audience for joining us. You folks out there, you've been with us on Capital Insight, and our guests have been Jan Kral, who is the Executive Director of Shangri-La, and Emil Graziani, who's the head of the Garton Foundation. And again, thank you for joining us, and please tune in next time.